In banking, the question is not whether a framework can power a demo. It is whether it can survive examination, accountability, and control. The LangChain may be excellent for experimentation, but it is not safe as a default production choice for any bank. We will look at the scenario, the governance gaps, the regulator's lens, and the alternatives built for control from day one. The stakes are operational, regulatory, and reputational. Over the next 7 sections, we move from the scenario to the decision. First, the banking case no CIO wants to face. Then the rise of LangChain, and the 6 gaps that matter most in regulated environments. Next, we test those gaps against regulator expectations, compare safer enterprise alternatives such as AWS Bedrock and Azure AI Foundry, define where LangChain still belongs, and finish with an action plan for banking leaders. Speed matters, but control decides production. A Tier 1 bank deploys an AI-powered credit decisioning agent for a $45 million commercial loan. It pulls internal financials, market data, and risk models, then approves the facility with covenants attached. 8 months later, the loan defaults under market stress. Then the regulators arrive, and the first question is unavoidable. Who actually made the decision, and can it be traced end to end? If not, the approval is not just risky, it is indefensible. When examiners challenge an AI decision, 3 questions decide everything. First, authorization and IAM. Who approved this exact decision chain, and what controls governed every agent and tool call? Second, data lineage and sovereignty. What customer data was accessed, where did it live, and did it cross sovereign boundaries? Third, reproducibility and audit trail. Can you recreate the full decision path with prompts, context, settings, reasoning, and downstream actions on demand? For a bank, those are not technical details. They are the difference between an explainable control process and an ungovernable risk. When a bank cannot answer those questions, the cost rises fast. The room goes quiet, the audit deepens, and remediation can move into the tens of millions. Beyond the technical rebuild, there may be Pillar 2 capital add-ons if model risk controls are judged weak. And the reputational hit can be worse, because an AI credit failure becomes a story about trust, governance, and leadership. This is not hypothetical. Variations of this risk are already forming in banks that move too quickly from demos to live regulated environments. LangChain earned its place by solving a real problem, connecting LLMs to enterprise data, APIs, and business logic. From late 2022 onward, it made PCS fast, flexible, and easy to iterate. By 2023 and 2024, banks were using it for credit memo summaries, compliance Q&A, and internal policy bots. But then scope creep began. What started as a demo became a production request, and by 2025 plus, the regulatory exposure was clear. Prototyping tooling is not the same as regulated production architecture. LangChain is strong where the goal is speed to proof of concept. It helps teams stand up RAG applications, swap models, compose chains and agents, and learn the space quickly. That is why the ecosystem took off. It supports credit memo summaries, policy Q&A, report drafting, and sandboxes for innovation workshops. But the advantage is contextual, not universal. The tool is excellent for prototyping. The mistake is assuming a prototyping engine automatically becomes a production control layer. Here is the core issue. Prototyping velocity is not production suitability. In a POC, synthetic data, isolated dev test cloud, and no regulatory obligations are enough to move quickly. In production, banks face real PI, data sovereignty rules, core banking integration, contractual liability, incident response timelines, and accountability to boards and regulators. LangChain was designed for the left column. Banks are deploying it in the right. That mismatch is exactly why governance, auditability, and identity must lead the architecture decision. These 6 gaps are the real test for LangChain banking readiness. Data residency, model training opt-out, IAM and identity, audit trail and reproducibility, compliance certifications, and SLA and vendor accountability are not minor implementation details. Each one is a control failure on its own. Together, They show why a fast prototype is not the same as a governed banking platform. The next sections unpack each gap in practical terms, and by the end, the pattern is hard to ignore. If the controls are missing, the risk is systemic. Once customer data leaves the bank VPC, it is no longer just visiting the cloud. It is moving through public API paths into global LLM infrastructure, where the exact region, subprocessors, deletion timeline, and contractual guarantees may be unclear. That matters for loan applications, KYC details, transaction history, and credit risk models. And the regulatory surface is broad. RBI Data Localization, DPDP Act, EU GDPR, Indonesia OJK rules, Singapore MAS cloud guidance, and UK FCA third-party risk can all be triggered by a single unregulated transit. The issue here is not whether enterprise agreements exist in theory. It is whether the LangChain setup actually verifies them in practice. In raw OpenAI API and LangChain deployments, model training opt-out controls can be weaker or simply unverified. That creates two risks. Your bank's unique credit risk patterns can leak into model improvement, and proprietary policy interpretations can become training signals. The result is competitive intelligence exposure. Banks spend millions refining these models, and once that knowledge enters a public training pipeline, the moat starts to erode. Identity is the silent failure until an investigator asks one simple question: who performed this action? Regulators expect a named human principal, just-in-time privilege, granular permissions, and full propagation from user to agent to tool call. They also expect immutable logs that show who, what, when, and why. LangChain typically gives you broad service accounts, long-lived API keys, and logs that stop at LangChain service. In a $45 million loan approval that later defaults, that is not enough for model risk management or incident response. For a credit decision to be reproduced forensically, every part of the pipeline must be captured immutably and permanently. That includes prompt engineering, retrieved context, every tool call and parameter, model temperature and top P, reasoning traces, downstream system actions, and proof that the record cannot be altered. Here, several items are missing or only partially traced. Langsmith helps, but partial tracing is not the same as regulator-ready forensic capture. If the bank cannot replay the decision exactly, it cannot defend the decision. Auditors will read this table as a third-party risk summary, not a technical roadmap. PCI DSS, ISO 27001, FIPS 140-2 SOC2 Type 2, GDPR and HIPAA, and the RBI Cyber Framework all matter for different reasons, but the status column is the same story. Not mapped, framework gap, not applicable, platform only, partial, or not addressed. That is exactly the kind of pattern that turns into a finding. If a certification is missing or only partially covered, the bank inherits the gap, and the risk team has to explain why. This is where accountability becomes existential. If an agent hallucinates a regulatory breach, fails a tool call mid-decision, misses a fraud detection SLA, or is compromised by prompt injection, the question is the same. Who is liable, who remediates, and who pays? In regulated banking, you need explicit financial remedies, incident response timelines, and business continuity obligations. Open-source prototyping frameworks do not give you that contract structure. Without it, the bank owns the risk even when the failure started elsewhere. The staircase matters because the risk does not stay isolated. Data residency, training opt-out, IAM and identity, audit trail, compliance certifications, and vendor accountability all compound into escalating regulatory exposure. That is why the historical LangChain serialization and prompt injection issues are so important. They show how secret theft can reach production financial data. Regulators do not evaluate these as 6 separate annoyances. They see a system-wide control weakness. When the controls stack up like this, the conclusion is straightforward. The framework is not production-safe for banking. The striking part is not that one regulator said this, but that all of them did. RBI, FCA, MAS, OCC, the EBA, the EU AI Act, APRA and BNM are converging on the same core demands: governance, explainability, auditability, human oversight, and data control. For banks, the question is no longer whether AI is useful. It is whether your platform can satisfy the same controls across every jurisdiction where you operate. Regulators keep asking 4 questions, and those questions define the architecture. Who was authorized to make the decision? What data was used, and where did it reside? Who is accountable when something fails? And can you reproduce the exact outcome, with timestamps and context on demand? That is why LangChain plus raw APIs require heroic custom engineering. In banking, that gap is not technical, it is regulatory. Enterprise platforms win by making control native, not optional. Under the EU AI Act, banking AI lands in the high-risk category almost everywhere that matters. Credit scoring, fraud detection, compliance screening, underwriting, even employment screening. And once a system is classified that way, the expectations are clear. Document the risk process, produce technical evidence, log consequential decisions, test for bias, maintain human oversight, and name the accountable owners. The EU benchmark is useful because it closely mirrors what other regulators now expect. That is the production path banks should favor. Platforms designed for regulated environments from day one. With AWS Bedrock plus Agent Core, or Azure AI Foundry, the controls are part of the stack: private connectivity, identity federation, immutable logging, data residency, compliance certifications, and responsible AI tooling. The point is simple. A bank should not be retrofitting governance after launch. It should choose a platform where governance is already an architectural property. AWS Bedrock Agent Core is a strong example of that design philosophy. Guardrails handle content filtering and PI redaction at inference. Knowledge bases add managed RAG with traceability. Agent Core supports multi-step workflows with rollback. VPC endpoints keep traffic private. CloudTrail preserves an immutable audit trail. And IAM Federation propagates the real principle through every request. That combination matters because regulators do not just want answers. They want proof of control. In practice, that means the platform is built to survive examination, not just a demo. Fiserv AgentOS is an important proof point. In May 2026, the company positioned it as an operating system for agentic AI in banking, built on Amazon Bedrock Agent Core with OpenAI. The use cases are not experimental. Core banking, payments, fraud detection, and compliance workflows. That signals a market shift. The largest infrastructure providers are moving from sandbox demonstrations to governed production, because that is where banking AI has to end up. This is the decision matrix every architecture committee should use. On the left, LangChain plus public APIs repeatedly leaves gaps in data residency, federation, audit trail, compliance evidence, training commitments, SLA, and vendor accountability. On the right, AWS Bedrock or Azure AI Foundry answer those same questions contractually and operationally. When the regulator asks for evidence, the enterprise platform is already ready. The message is not flexibility. It is survivability under regulated scrutiny. LangChain still has a place, and it is an important one. Use it for rapid proof of concepts, anonymized data, internal tools, workshops, and early pattern exploration. But do not let that experimentation drift into customer data, credit decisions, AML/KYC, fraud, or core banking. The real failure is scope creep. Moving a POC into regulated production before architecture, risk, and compliance have signed off. That is where the boundary has to stay. The real danger isn't the first demo. It's the quiet drift that happens after the demo works. A sandbox POC feels harmless, then an internal pilot starts asking for real data, the expanded pilot skips the governance review, and suddenly production is live with customer data and no formal sign-off. That's why this creep is so hard to see until the regulator audit. By then, the risk has moved from zero to critical, and the organization is already exposed. If LangChain, N8N, or direct LLM API calls are touching real customer data today, act immediately. Start this week with a full inventory of every deployment across business units and geographies. Then classify each use case against the risk framework. Next, commission an independent architecture and regulatory review instead of relying only on internal teams. And finally, enforce a hard policy. Prototyping tools stay in prototyping environments, while production requires enterprise-grade platforms with built-in controls. Make that visible before the next board meeting. This belongs in the board pack because governance ownership has to be explicit. The CIO should review architecture, procurement, and the path from POC to production. The CRO owns model risk, AI classification, and regulatory readiness. General counsel should test third-party contracts, data processing terms, and liability exposure. The COO needs incident response and continuity planning. And the board or audit committee should approve policy and oversee residual risk. If no one owns it, the bank owns the fallout. A practical risk tiering gives the risk team a common language. At the top end, credit decisioning, AML screening, fraud detection, and customer-facing AI belong on enterprise platforms with full governance and board visibility. As you move down, the controls relax only slightly. Risk committee sign-off for high risk, CISO review for medium risk, and at the low end, LangChain is acceptable only in isolated environments with synthetic data. The rule is simple. The higher the impact, the stronger the control. These are the core takeaways. LangChain is excellent for prototypes, but it was never built for regulated banking production. The 6 gaps that matter most: data residency, training opt-out, IAM audit trail, certifications, and SLA, each create their own findings. Global regulators now ask the same 4 questions: authorization, data lineage, accountability, and reproducibility. Enterprise platforms like AWS Bedrock and Azure AI Foundry address those requirements by design, and governed agentic AI is already here. The next incident will force the issue unless leaders act now. If you need practitioner-led guidance, the focus is on responsible AI architecture, regulatory alignment, and production readiness for banking and financial services. The support is organized around 4 practical services: AI governance gap analysis, architecture advisory, regulatory readiness, and board and leadership briefings. Each one is designed to help teams move from concern to action. With independent review, target state design, pre-examination preparation, and executive education. For the full details on each service, use the link and information in the video description below. For EU and UK teams, the regulatory clock is already running. The EU AI Act enters force in August 2024. Prohibited practices are banned in February 2025. GPI obligations apply in August 2025. High-risk system obligations land in August 2026, and legacy systems must comply by August 2027. The core articles focus on risk management, data governance, documentation, logging, transparency, human oversight, monitoring, and incident reporting. And the penalty backdrop is severe. Up to €30 million or 6% of global turnover. Thank you for watching. Stay rigorous, stay compliant, and build responsibly. If this perspective was useful, share it with your CIO, CRO, risk teams, and architects. Then add your experience in the comments, especially the lessons that came from moving from prototypes to production. If you want more direct, experience-based analysis for BFSI leaders, subscribe and stay with us. The goal is simple: keep innovation moving, but keep governance ahead of the rollout.